Better Preach, Episode 39, The Crisis of Bad Preaching, with Father Joshua Whitfield. Welcome to Better Preach, a podcast for Catholic leaders on developing and delivering great Catholic talks. I'm your host, Ryan O'Hara, a 25-year vet of college and young adult ministry. Thanks for inviting me into your journey of communicating the true, the good, and the beautiful. Have you ever heard a bad homily? I know I have. No clear connection to the readings. It sort of rambles on, and there's no application to everyday life. Well, this may not be the experience at every Mass. It happens more often than it should. In my conversation with Father Joshua Whitfield today, we discuss where this crisis of bad preaching comes from, what priests and lay people can do about it, and among many other things, what role the Liturgy of the Hours, yes, the official prayer of the Church, what the official prayer of the Church can do to bring about renewal of preaching in the Church. Father Joshua Whitfield currently serves as the pastor of St. Rita Catholic Community in Dallas, a former Episcopal priest trained for ministry in England. After his conversion to Catholicism, he was ordained a Catholic priest through the pastoral provision of Pope St. John Paul II in 2012. He and his wife Alli live in Dallas with their 5 children. Originally from Glen Rose, Texas, the son of a football coach, he's an alumnus of Texas Tech University, the University of Leeds, and Duke University. He is the author of several books, including The Crisis of Bad Preaching, Redeeming the Heart and Way of the Catholic Preacher, which is the subject of our conversation today. If this podcast has been helpful to you, please share a written review and rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I'd love to connect with you on Instagram. I'm over there at Better Preach, all one word. Let's get into it. Father Joshua, welcome to the Better Preach podcast. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. I was looking forward to it.
Not long ago, I caught wind of this tremendous talk that you gave through the OSV Talks series, kind of like a Catholic TED Talks on the crisis of bad preaching, of which is just a powerful kind of stop you in your tracks kind of title. But it's also the title of a book that you've written. And so I said, I have to have Father Joshua on the podcast with me, because that's something that I know many people would love to kind of dig into. And so as you put that book together, I'd love for you to give us a little bit of a diagnosis even. What is the kind of the eye of that storm of kind of so-called bad preaching, the bullseye of the crisis? How do we kind of land in the position we are today?
I think after we've accepted that although there's good preaching and great preaching out there, on the whole, I think it's safe to say that there's a crisis of bad preaching. What is the cause of that? I'm sure it's multifactorial, right? It could be plainly the fact that young men in seminary are not adequately trained. It's an underfunded, under-resourced art when it comes to seminary. And so that shows clearly, just from a technical standpoint and from rhetoric and delivery and how to craft a message. We don't do that well as Catholics. And then I think there could be underneath it a more real spiritual malaise, a weariness when it comes to the routines of cultural Catholicism, the pressures to, get Mass over and done with in 50 minutes or so, all of these things conspire to sort of disincentivize good preaching, right? And, again, I think another sort of issue could be, I talk about it in the talk, but I talk about it in the book as well, this sort of assumption that many preachers have that they're not bad preachers, when the fact is they're not very good. And because the people of God are so kind that they lie to them, And so I think there is sort of a failure to recognize one's own part in not being the best preacher one could be.
And I appreciate that malaise, the pressures of time, the poor training, almost the, I don't know, living down to our expectations.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure that I knew what good preaching as a cradle Catholic. I didn't know what good preaching looked like until I saw it, and it was outside of the context of the church. In fact,
Mhm. Mhm.
kind of many kind of current kind of evangelical Protestant preachers, and where I saw, oh, I didn't even know this was possible. I wonder, again, as would have mentioned in the intro, you're a married Catholic priest. You converted from the Episcopal Church in Texas there,
Mhm.
but you may have had a different exposure, different training. Was there anything in particular from your training you hold on to even today that made a deep impact on you, or what sort of inspired good preaching in you?
I am the preacher I am today because of the preachers I was blessed to be shaped by growing up.
Yeah.
And really that's sort of the whole thing behind an entire chapter in the book where I talk about belonging to the communion of preachers. And,
Right.
I mean, not just sort of the ecclesiological reality of preaching, but the very particular tradition of preaching, which, made a person like me. My father he's a great orator in his own right. And
Mm.
he's to this day a Protestant preacher. That there's many of his mannerisms, his idioms, his cadence have, just they're mine now, right?
Mm.
And but not just my dad, my parish priest growing up in the little Episcopal church I went to, preached like a Baptist. I mean, he had his Bible open and we went to town on the scriptures every Sunday. But it was captivating. He was into it. My great mentor, who was a bishop in the Church of England growing up, I just absorbed his skill. So these and several other people in my life made me the preacher I am today. If you somehow could get a thumbnail sketch of my experience, you would be able to pick up even the tiniest things like cadence or turns of phrase or the way I pause.
Hmm.
You would be able to say, okay, he got this from this person, he got this from that person. And it's just growing up in that tradition of good preaching that did more for me than any homiletics class or
Yeah.
book or program. And so, that really, for me, was the most important thing, belonging to good preaching. And Augustine says that, he says, I would rather send someone to go listen to a good preacher than make him read all the books of rhetoric. And because we're imitative people, we imitate people.
Right.
And that's a really important thing.
So you're making that great observation about what we're observing, kind of this external reality that we're internalizing. But you also wrote just a powerful line. You have a way with words. One of your phrases or one of the lines in your book, you said, if there isn't prayer, there isn't preaching. And I remember reading that and stopping and kind of underlining it. That is an audacious statement. What is that irreplaceable connection between the preacher and their prayer life?
If a person has a natural gift for public speaking, he or she can manage for a
Hmm.
while speaking well, but the well will run dry,
Hmm.
right? No matter who you are, and preacher particularly so, right? And, Augustine says this. So many of the other spiritual masters say this. Augustine talks about, you got to, fill yourself up before you can belch forth the gospel, and which is a very weird way to put it, but Benedict talks about this, and this kind of goes to the heart of what we've been getting at, and that is, I'm just plagiarizing Aristotle. One of the characteristic features of good speaking or good preaching is ethos, right? And when we sense that the speaker is in it, when it's not just the shallow delivery of information, as if you're reading some sort of audio book of the
Hmm.
Second Vatican Council. But when you really sense that the speaker's in it and his heart's in it, that's ethos, right? That's character. And you can't really fake that. And so ethos has to be nurtured by firsthand experience, and firsthand experience of the gospel of Jesus Christ is prayer, right? It's what religion gives you. Phillips Brooks, who I talk a lot about in the book, who's one of my great heroes in preaching, says that very beautifully. It's for the shallow preacher, their words would just sort of flow over him. The true messenger of God, the gospel comes through him.
Yeah.
Right. And as I said, that you could fool people for a while on that, but not in the long run.
What does that look like in your own life? Kind of how your prayer and preaching are connected.
Yeah, I think, I struggle to pray just as everybody else does, beware of the priest that tells you his prayer life is perfect. I struggle to pray, to get up early in the morning where the kids are making their noise and stare at an icon of Jesus till I can't do that anymore. We pray the Liturgy of the Hours in the parish publicly.
What's the pattern for that?
7:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the evening.
So each weekday or?
Every day, yeah. And we have sung Vespers on Sunday evening.
Beautiful.
One, because Vatican II called for it. The Liturgy of the Hours is really, really important for preaching for me. It puts me in the rhythm and the discipline and in the language of the praying church day in and day out.
Yeah.
Then it also creates for me a small community of people who are praying alongside me, lay people, most of them. And just the ad hoc friendships, the ad hoc conversations, which sort of arise around the rhythm of praying every single day, really, really shapes me as a preacher. And that is a significant amount of my preparation, to be honest. And so I highly recommend it. I think, the priest who prays the daily office or the Liturgy of the Hours sort of by his bedside privately, that's not what the church calls for. I would even push it a corruption of the Liturgy of the Hours. And so it's a huge opportunity to just be within the language game of the church.
Yeah, it's a prayer that's meant for a community and to be prayed in common. And one of the features that I love about St. Paul's Outreach, who I work for, and we have Catholic households on campuses around the country. This is our prayer each morning, that we begin with the Liturgy of the Hours and praying with the church, and then kind of their personal prayer flows out of that. And we have a unique opportunity because folks are living in common. And there are so many ways in which, the call and response nature of it, and the two choruses, if you will. And
to talk specifically about how it affects preaching, at least the way it works for me, is having become my sort of spiritual rhythm. When I sit down to see what the readings are on any given Sunday, whether it's several weeks in advance and I'm being a good boy and, getting my ducks in a row as I should, or if it's crazy in the parish and I look at what tomorrow's readings are, I've already done all the deep work, right? And so I can more readily discern the Vox Christi, so to speak, through the scriptures, what the church is whispering on any particular Sunday, because I'm in it. And then, the church came out several years ago, these wonderful documents on preaching, and I recommend them to everybody. But I forget which one it was, the first one, at the end it said everybody should have, sort of like a meeting where you have a focus group, where you get parishioners together, a little committee where you talk about the homily and talk about what the homily should be. With all due respect, that's a terrible idea. It's just, that doesn't work. That's just another meeting. Better if priests prayed the Liturgy of the Hours and then had coffee. There's your focus group, so, practically speaking, I mean, prayer causes preaching.
Yeah. I've actually been interested in that concept of how can lay people support clergy and play the role that we're supposed to play. Is there, maybe it isn't kind of this meeting in anticipation. Are there other ways in which, there's good ways to give feedback, good ways to prepare? I know that you've given some real thought to what we can do as lay people to
participate and to not miss what God's doing in and through preaching?
Yeah, I think both sides need to come at it a little bit differently. I think on the clergy side of things, the clericalism is a real thing.
Hmm.
It is, and even within the amongst clergy, clericalism is a real thing. I mean, the caste system in many instances, and so a priest is going to have to get comfortable with being real with the people of God and with his own people of God. And that can only come by way of prayer and friendship and letting your guard down. Not selling the store when it comes to the holiness of priesthood.
Sure.
But by being real with your people and empowering them to be real toward you, right? And this gets to the lay side of it. And that is the lay people are going to have to stop lying to their priests, right? I mean, to this day, I'll have people come to me in the narthex on a Sunday and compliment me on a homily I didn't preach because the deacon was preaching. I mean, come on, we don't need to compliment
caught
Father
red-handed.
every single thing, And
Wow.
so, and I think, practically speaking, again, if you were at morning prayer here at St. Rita this morning, Deacon Bob officiated, right? We had 8 or 9 people, coffee, this afternoon at 5:00, Matt's going to officiate. I'll be there. I'll give the blessing at the end because it's the work of God, right? And so we just do it together. And from that comes, a humble cooperation, which is actually the church.
Right. Yeah. Well, which brings me to my next question. As a married priest with kids, you have a unique window into at least the experience of fatherhood, of marriage, and I don't know, competitive advantage. I don't know what we want to call it, but it's a unique window that you have that I have to believe informs your preaching in a way that if you didn't have that, it would be different. Of course, we're not, married priesthood isn't something that's going to be happening anytime soon, nor are we advocating for that. But here you are. And yet, are there ways that your brother priests could gain access to some of those insights through other means that would help strengthen their preaching? Sometimes I get the impression that what my life is like as a married man with kids, and there's something missing in terms of what I'm able to hear from our parish priests in this regard. So I'm just curious if there are ways that priests could do more or something different to gain some access that you have naturally.
Right. It's a good question. I'm, as we were talking before the show, no one's calling for a change in discipline.
No.
That's the church's business, and we're faithful to it. And I'm a big believer in clerical celibacy, and I think we would miss it quite suddenly if it were suddenly gone. But it is true that my experience is different, and that different experience affects my preaching mostly in a beneficial way. And I think the way I think about it is, this as a dad, the way I describe it is that the moment my first kid was born, it's like someone flipped a switch on in my brain, which opened up a moral horizon I did not know existed, which told me things, gave me things to know that I didn't even know it was possible to know, or that one could know them. There was a whole new room of knowledge which I did not even know existed.
Yeah.
And so your world's different. The universe is different. And to this day, I do not know how you gain access to that knowledge.
Yeah.
Outside being in the room to watch your child be born. I don't mean to say that it's not possible, but it's such a unique thing that I don't know. So that said, that's all very romantic and almost mystical in my description of it. But what follows from that is noise and snot and yelling and the beauties and joys and chaos of kids, which causes a wisdom, which just like Liturgy of the Hours does, it affects me, right?
Yeah.
Early on, and especially in the Catholic preaching world, I was concerned about bringing in the experience of fatherhood and family life to my preaching. I quickly decided that I couldn't keep that out sort of artificially. One, because ethos and being real is fundamental to good preaching. And so, I've actually come across some people who say I would never bring my kids up in my homilies, which sounds like a dreadful piece of advice. Early on, I used to always like stop and give a disclaimer to the visitors, but now the most I'll say is, Google it, because it's the milieu, it's me, it's my experience, and that affects, and it affects how I preach. My kids have taught me more about God than almost anything else. And so that's a valuable experience. So the next side of that question is how do my celibate brethren approximate that? I would say first, and this is what a great mentor in the Catholic Church taught me by his own experience, really, by his own witness, and that is holiness can fill in all the gaps, right? Genuine holiness, whether it's a celibate holiness or a married holiness. Mm-hmm. If you have a priest who's genuinely holy, none of this matters.
Yeah, that's good.
So that's that, but not the easiest thing to find. On a little less mystical scale, I think priests need friends.
Yeah.
Social emotional intelligence, it should be something that's genuinely looked at in the seminaries. Cultivating, encouraging genuine friendships outside of clerical circles is important.
Yeah.
I've got a colleague here, a parochial vicar of mine, who embodies that beautifully and perfectly, And so the friendships he's made in the parish and beyond the parish are beautiful and faithful, and they're so enriching for him personally, and they make him normal. Yeah. And it comes through in every aspect of his ministry, including preaching. And that should be encouraged and by pastors with their young priests coming through seminaries. And we should just also be honest how difficult that is today in a church still so affected by sex abuse scandals, right? We're in an age where we're scared for priests to come close to us, where we live in an age where priests are scared for people to come close to them, right? And that's a real issue. We think, from a liability standpoint or from just a scared of it standpoint, we think the best thing to do is for the priest to sort of retreat in their own little rectories, pray their Liturgy of the Hours, and find holiness alone. But parish priests are not meant to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Parish priests cannot do that. And so we got to figure that one out. And that's, we can't put that all on the priest to figure out either. That's got to be the people of God being patient and kind and understanding, so.
Yeah. And I would think, especially in a large metropolitan area, if a diocese is kind of stretching for miles, priests are transitioning between different parishes, and
right.
Then maybe there's even a distance factor as it relates to friendships and things. And so there are a number of factors that are working against us in that respect. Yeah. But it sounds like holiness is kind of this great universalizer as it gives access to things that naturally we don't have access to. And yet by grace, there's insight, there's wisdom, that there's even ways in which I know that you've probably had this experience that you've preached something and somebody else comments, how powerful it was that you said this, but you didn't say that, or you said it differently, but they heard it. And so that is really powerful.
Yeah. You think your homily sort of fell on the floor and, did nothing, but it actually did something. And again, to on the celibate thing and holiness, you've probably had this experience. I'm sure we all have, even my celibate colleagues, they'll say something or they might not even have meant it, but they'll offer an insight about marriage and about family life that they will enlighten me.
Imagine priests and deacons listening today, and they're preaching this weekend. What's the number one thing you think they could do if they could adjust something that could really help them in their preaching, even this weekend?
Good question. I think it's helpful. I mean, even to me, I'm a professional Christian, professional preacher. I wrote a book on the topic. But for me, I have to remind myself and cherish the gift of the fact that God called me to preach to these people.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just the case that I was assigned. God called me to preach. And so therefore, God has enough trust in me to deliver a word worthy of the gospel and worthy of the mission. And so it's faith. It's that spiritual trust that I have to remind myself, that of all the people that day, God called you. It's not an accident, right? And so, I know that's sort of, slippery and spiritual, but that really, really does matter. That I've been called to say something to these people.
Do you think it's kind of out of mind for many priests and deacons, that it's more functional, it's more they get in their head, or there's other things, and they forget that fundamental truth that they and no one else was called to preach to these people this weekend, for instance?
I think sometimes we can see it too much as a task,
yeah,
rather than as a moment. And I mean, Augustine talked about preaching with hilaritas, right, with that joy and delight. And you need to have that delight in your preaching. And so what does that look like practically? I think, okay, you've worked hard on your homily. You might have notes, you might have bullet points, and that's wonderful, and hold on to them. But somehow you're going to have to take all that work and transform it into an orality which is believable. There's a deacon a long time ago, great man. I used to hear him preach all the time. And he was always behind the ambo with his notes. And I'm not opposed to notes in the slightest, but it was very mechanical.
Yeah.
But then I heard him preach in another context around people that he was more comfortable with. And he didn't have notes. And he just talked, spoke. And I went to him and I said, why don't you do that here? Oh, I couldn't do that. Yes, you can, And so anything I would say that you can do to be confidently in that place with joy, that it's really you talking. But that's a frightening thing. And sometimes you got to push yourself over the edge.
I would love to hear just a bit on your process of preparation, and what that looks like. Really, what does your kind of Sunday preparation look like? What is that process?
Sunday's a bit different. As I said earlier, one is always mindful of the meta narrative, so to speak, of the liturgical year, the sanctoral cycle. One always knows what's going on. And then you spend time with the scripture itself, Lectio Divina. If you need commentary, by all means, dive into it. There's a ton back there, behind me. And, but you use a commentary. You don't let the commentary write your homily, because you're preaching is something different than teaching.
Yeah.
But that could spend anywhere from a half hour to an hour on a Monday or Tuesday. And then I usually marinate on it. I let it marinate, so to speak. And when either time arises or if it's pre-planned and I can stick to it, I'll write a homily on a Thursday or a Friday. And if sometimes push comes to shove, on a Saturday. Each preacher, I think, needs to do his own thing. My predecessor is now the Bishop of Lubbock, plans his homilies out weeks in advance and goes back and adjusts as he needs to, as things right. I can't function that way. I'm adamant that each preacher come up with his own method, right? And again, when it comes to delivery, I guess, sometimes my homilies will be written out completely footnoted, right? Just because that's the way I roll, right? And like you get on my website and the homilies on there will be footnoted, right? Part of that is I'm a reader and that's the way my brain works. But it's also very helpful that when I think, oh, I said this somewhere, I can easily find it. But that's not my preaching in entirety. Here lately, I've been doing a lot of bullet point outlines, and that's been working well for me. Sometimes I've got a little book that I note in. Sometimes it appears to be extemporaneous, but it's not. Dr. King used to be able to memorize his sermons and deliver them perfectly. And, I've done that. And so I just, every so often I will not stay behind the ambo. I'll walk around, but I mix it all up because I think variety helps preacher on that. But in the book, I talk a little bit about, if I'm going to say something delicate and I need to be really careful about my words, I'm going to write it out.
Yeah. That's smart.
And you orally perform the text, right?
Well, and you can listen to very different lectors and see how that goes. And,
Exactly.
I'm curious, as you preach multiple times in a weekend, is your second go or your third go, does it always get better? Or do you find how does that work out?
It doesn't always get better. Most of the time, I should say it gets better, but sometimes it doesn't.
What do you find inhibits that?
Depends on the time of day. If it's tiring, if you're tired, if you've been rushed, you've got it, mass is over and you've got to go handle this situation.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's inexplicable. You just thought, I wish people could have heard the other one. And so most of the time it gets better.
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't. And it's funny that,
Yeah. I find that if I give a talk that I felt really good about, was well prepared, and I give it again for the first time, oftentimes I'm trying to mimic certain things that went well. And in the mimicking or in the attempt to mimic, something gets lost in translation.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's usually like the third or fourth time that I might give a talk that things really kind of land and I cement on the ideas versus just sort of imitating myself, which sounds terrible.
But I think that's exactly right. I mean, it happens to me that I know exactly what you're saying. That happens to me. And I think, in imitating yourself, again, you sort of lose ethos.
Yeah.
Right. And so, because the Lord wants you to talk, not the simulacrum of you,
Right.
And
right.
So it happens to me.
There's a real attentiveness even to self and to the Holy Spirit, to what you have prepared, but also kind of losing yourself and letting go of self for the sake of this thing versus kind of, and that's why I've struggled with memorization and what that plays and what does memorization kind of look like, in the context of this sort of extemporaneous preaching,
Well, I think, sports psychologists talk about flow, right? My best preaching is when you're in that sort of flow moment and when the cadence of the language is sort of flowing through you and it's on fire with the gospel and it's the truth and it's totally you speaking and they may perfectly match the words on paper, but the paper doesn't matter, so It's like the flow thing.
I think it's one of the things I love so much about preaching and speaking in general, but is this art and science confluence. There's this very technical side of things, and there's the preparation, there's the proximate preparation and the remote preparation, all that stuff, all the things you're describing. And then there's this mysterious art form that emerges as well and is hopefully crafted and sharpened over time. And so it really has this incredible arc. Again, here I am. This is why we're doing this podcast. If there's going to be one thing I could talk about week in and week out, it would be, this subject, just have a deep love and fascination with it. And also a hope that our best days, as you mentioned, and even, I think you mentioned this in your book, that the best of preaching, or your hope is that the best of preaching is still in front of us.
Oh yeah.
And to that end, I'd love I'm looking for three book recommendations. I could go for just one, but I want to give, you seem to be so well read and this is an area of expertise. I'd love if the next three books a preacher might read, what would they be? And then also, what signs of hope do you see kind of breaking through in the midst of this crisis?
So three books in addition to mine, obviously, but
right. No, that is a gift. So three books, including yours.
I
not
would
including yours.
Reading Aristotle's Rhetoric is still something one should do.
Okay.
If anybody is a public speaker, get a good translation, good commentary. Kennedy's translation is probably the best, I think.
Okay, good.
Aristotle's rhetoric still is extremely valuable. The second I would say would be Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana translation. The New City Press translation is like on teaching Christianity. If you can't stomach the first 3 books, I'm really talking about book 4.
Okay, good.
Where he talks about preaching. A 2A on that would be Gregor the Great's Pastoral Rule, which is a riff on De Doctrina as far as preaching goes. And then the third book, and I talk a lot about it in my book, is Phillips Brooks' lectures on preaching that he delivered in Yale in the 19th century, which are not translated there in English, but which are bound together in a book called The Joy of Preaching. And all those texts fit together. Phillips Brooks, probably one of the greatest preachers of the 19th century. He was the Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts. His other claim to fame is he wrote A Little Town of Bethlehem.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And he smoked like a chimney too, but a great preacher. And that really is one of the best books on preaching I've ever read in my entire life. And then, the reason for optimism, and I am optimistic. I wouldn't play in there and that was a quote from Phillips Brooks, actually, but best preaching it. I wasn't just trying to end on a high note. I believe it. One, because I believe that the Holy Spirit, descended at Pentecost and did not ascend. And so God is at work. And that, the world's a pretty funny place, especially at the moment. And it's pretty hostile and people get mad at each other. And it's violent. But, goodness gracious, I was at the hospital once a while back where this Methodist chaplain grabbed me to baptize a baby who had been in the hospital since he was born at 20 weeks. And mom and dad had been there forever and they were good Catholic people and they desperately needed to see a priest. And so I baptized that baby and the child's doing great and came to the church and the other day and they're like, that's the church, man. And that's not on Twitter. That's not in any sort of headline. And that's going. People are falling in love with Jesus. People are, drinking from the side of Christ through the sacraments of the church every single day. Pentecost, I call for Pentecost at the end of the book. And, maybe it'll be like a great awakening. That'd be awesome. I don't know. But Pentecost will happen in some form or fashion. And I see it happen every day. And podcasts like this or initiatives that you're seeing like at Notre Dame or the University of Dallas, those are like footnotes to what God is doing, right? And I think preaching is getting better. I really do. Christians are once again remembering that they need to be worth the name Catholic,
And it makes me think too, in this day, and we decry, all of our screens and all of that, and for good reason. But we do have this sort of universal access to great communication. Again, it wasn't until, I didn't see great preaching in person. This was at the early days of the internet and started to go, oh, that, somebody might have watched it, on TV perhaps. And I spoke with a priest earlier in this series, and it was kind of the evangelical preachers on TV that sort of gave him a different view of things. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
But now with YouTube, and we can have access, again, albeit disembodied and mediated through a screen, but you can observe things that perhaps were not observable 30 years ago, 60 years ago, and so on. And so I think there's another kind of reason for hope, given that exposure and access that you see as so critical.
I think that's dead on. The tools of technology, social media, YouTube, podcast, all that stuff, they work well when they are used by people who also live in real community.
Yeah.
That's the key. If you see someone kind of go off the deep end over time on Twitter, my guess is that they've become more and more isolated, and so that's another topic. But I think the beauty of the variety of the Catholic communion is only enriched when a guy in Texas talks to a guy in, the Great White North.
Right.
Over something that's not hockey. And so that's awesome.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Father, it's been a great pleasure, a great honor to have you on. As soon as I saw the book and saw a preview of your talk, I said, we've got to make this happen. Where could people connect with you and the great work that you're doing online?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter. It's at Father Josh TX, at Father Josh Texas. And just Google me. I've got a website, fatherjoshwhitfield.com and all that stuff. And, Google.
Do you have your homilies there online?
Most of the time, yeah. Sometimes I do. And if at least once every couple of weeks, I'll put them on there. And other stuff I write for like OSV, and I'm all over the place, man. So just Google my name.
We'll have the links to those books that you recommended, your book as well, in the show notes, website, your social handle, and places for folks to connect with you. Awesome. Again, Father, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
No, thank you, and thanks for all you're doing.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Hey, brother.
If this podcast has been helpful to you, please share a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. A big shout out to my podcasting production partner, David Vessel. Thanks for making this look and sound so good. And all of you have millions of choices when you podcast. Thanks for press and play today. See you next time.